What's up, Hellbound friends? Welcome back to Philosophically Godless. I'm the Atheist Rationale. Now, I know I'm not your favorite cartoon straw man. I'm not even a cartoon. But none of that really matters because the Godless Iowan has asked me to gift you my rather mediocre presents. And I know what you're thinking. Who the fuck is this guy and why does he look like he's 16? Honestly, I couldn't tell you, but I make atheist videos, you know, goofing on cringe, debunking Christian apologetics, and I really like calling out people like Matt Powell and Steven Anderson. I also make a lot of really bad jokes and reference a lot of TV shows. If that's something that interests you, consider subscribing to the channel, and if not, watch this video anyway and consider it a trial run. I think you're going to want to stick around today though, because I got something extra special for you guys. I'm going to introduce to you today a guy by the name of John St. Julian Baba Wanyama, a man with a rather peculiar obsession with Jim Carrey, and an even more peculiar obsession with something called the sacred secretion.
I couldn't miss a chance to try and get this video on today if I can, because something very profound has happened inside the public eye. It was Jim Carrey speaking about the sacred secretion.
Let's roll my intro and dive right the fuck in. So who is John St. Julian? Now my original plan for this guest video was to respond to this hilarious clip of Jim Carrey going crazy on the Norm Macdonald show.
This substance comes from your medulla, makes the trip down your spine to your sacrum, which is
Quick, get a dictionary.
Christ coming down into human form.
Yes.
And if you don't squander that essence, that sexual essence, it ascends again and goes back up to heaven, which is your thing.
Brain chemicals and Jesus?
Alrighty then.
I figured the jokes would be writing themselves, plus you get that added benefit of a Christmas episode.
It's also the story of Santa Claus. Why he comes down the chimney is because this juice or this whatever substance actually passes what's called the claustrum, which is where they got Santa Claus.
What I didn't realize, however, is how excited people get when celebrities talk about things that they believe in. Or that you might accidentally download their response video rather than the original clip you were looking for.
It was Jim Carrey speaking about the sacred secretion.
The person you just saw is John St. Julian Baba Wanyama, and he's the subject of today's video. And as you can tell, he seems to be a pretty vocal advocate for something called the sacred secretion.
And it's the secretion I've spoke about in length that we secrete within our bodies and then we return via correct living, via temperance and pure thoughts towards others, which lead to pure actions. And in my experience, service to God.
Now before we really dive in here, let me just take this beanie off and let's examine the whole idea of the sacred secretion a little bit.
It's true. I have used the sacred secretion. I have used the alchemy of Kundalini, as it's been labelled with him, or the transformation of that energy within you to become the best functioning human being I can.
It seems these magical brain secretions, whatever they are, have made John St. Julian here the best possible human he could ever be. In fact,
but without the sacred secretion, you're 30% of the human being you can be.
he's a full 70% more human than the rest of us who haven't yet accessed that sacred secretion. But look no further, because John St. Julian is here to liberate you.
This knowledge literally can liberate humanity. 100%. Humanity can be liberated by the knowledge of the sacred secretion, because in liberating themselves with that, they learn how the human body works at its best.
Liberation and access to all knowledge of the human body? But does this knowledge do anything else, John?
Goodbye depression. Goodbye lack of temperance. Goodbye sexual immorality. Goodbye pornography addictions. Goodbye alcohol addictions. Goodbye drug addictions. Goodbye obsessive compulsive problems. Goodbye judgment of others. Goodbye nearly all negative behaviors.
Ah yes, not only does this sacred secretion thing take away all your negative behaviors and your depression, but it also takes away that weird urge of yours to troll the MILF section on Pornhub.com. I mean, at least if that's what you consider to be sexually immoral. Oh, and that chemical imbalance that required medical intervention? Gone! And all you need to do is preserve the sacred secretion. God, I really hope that's just brain chemicals, because that's an innuendo if I've ever heard one. All jokes aside, I am going to have to get serious here because unfortunately, everything you just heard John St. Julian say, he believes wholeheartedly. And I'm here to explain to you today exactly why all those ideas are a lot more dangerous than they seem to be on the surface. But before I can do that, I have to return to the question that preceded my intro. Who is John St. Julian? Now, John is a very interesting fellow, to say the least. He started a charity about 4 years ago called Share Tanzania, and I guess he did it because God told him to? And in all honesty, it looks like the charity does a lot of real good for the people in Tanzania. They provide hundreds of impoverished children throughout Tanzania with access to medical care, food, and even education. And if the guy is helping out so many people, I can really get down with that. It's really hard to escape the cycle of poverty. I myself was barely able to escape homelessness with a nice combination of grant money from school and having 1 or 2 jobs to go along with it. And even with that, my girlfriend and I have to help each other out just to barely make it. And that's not to say that we have it the worst, because there's so many factors that go into it that make it much harder for a lot of other people. Like the Children Share Tanzania helps, for instance. I mean, not only do they live in a country that just doesn't have the same kind of resources that a country like the United States has, but a lot of the children he takes care of are orphans. Some of them also suffer from HIV or were victims of child abuse and needed somewhere to go. A portion of them are even children with disabilities or conditions such as autism or Down syndrome. And to top it all off, he even has a dog rescue that houses over 60 dogs. There's no denying he's doing a lot of good here. He for sure helps hundreds of children and even a lot of dogs. It just starts to get weird the more you look into it. You see, part of Share Tanzania is the Feather's Tail Children's Village. This just happens to be where John St. Julian lives with those 98 children, 48 of which are special needs children. He also seems to take in some of the mothers of these children as well. However, while they do have an on-site physiotherapist and an on-site occupational therapist, which I assume helps tremendously, the only listed requirement to be on staff in the village for the special needs children is to literally be a parent of a special needs child. While I don't doubt the fact that being a parent can provide a lot of help, you should probably have more qualified staff there around the clock in order to take care of these children. Especially if a large portion of these children have HIV or AIDS, because a physiotherapist in that situation just isn't going to cut it. But I guess it's good they have an NGO vehicle that's an hour away from the hospital, right? In fact, why have a village at all instead of something in the main city closer to the hospital? Looking into Feather's Tail Children's Village, I noticed that it's presented pretty magically, at least on John St. Julian's YouTube channel. John produced a video for a comic book that he wrote entitled Feather's Tail Comic, Joshua's Story. The video features the story of a boy named Joshua and his sister Miriam. Both of them are dealing with an alcoholic father who in a drunken stupor killed his daughter's boss. And after finally summoning up the courage to run away from their father, they're greeted by a magical bird who leads them on the road to Mount Kilimanjaro. And well, Share Tanzania's Feathertail Village is located near the Kilimanjaro Mountains. Hold on to that thought though. Now remember how I told you John St. Julian was called by God to start his charity? Well, feathers to him seem to be messages from God, and this seems to be where he drew the inspiration to name his village. Just listen to the guy.
Now, I receive feathers as a sign from God. They are a sign of comfort for me, and also can lead me in the right direction of where I need to go. You see the moon rising above me. And I called the children's village, where we are now, Feather's Tail, due to these feathers.
Now think about it for a second. John St. Julian believes he gets messages from God, sometimes directly and sometimes through the use of feathers. This I would think implies that he's pretty special. Then he distributes a comic book that just so happens to depict 2 children that deal with the exact same problems that a lot of the children in his village just so happen to have dealt with as well. Then those 2 children seem to be saved by the same kind of messages that John gets, only to be led in the direction of the Feather's Tail Children's Village. What kind of message does this give to the children who read the comic? What kind of message does this send to a child in need who might find this comic but hasn't exactly found the village yet? Come to think of it, what kind of message does this send to the children in the village who are reading the comic? Does it not sort of mythologize the whole concept of the village as some sort of God-ordained safe haven for the children? And is John St. Julian held up as some sort of Christ-like figure? While I'm not exactly sure about the whole demagogue thing, it doesn't really help Julian at all that he secretly runs a church inside the village based around all of this bullshit. And why exactly does the village need a church anyway? That shouldn't be something you need in your village in order to take care of the children. It honestly just takes away from the resources you could be using to get those children, you know, people more qualified than mothers that can help in those emergency situations when you're dealing with children suffering with HIV and AIDS. If you're wondering why I'm saying the church is a secret, it's because the church isn't mentioned on any of the charity websites. Not the official government website for the charity, not in anywhere of the legal documents for the charity that lists its operations and objectives, not even on the official website for Share Tanzania, which just so happens to have an entire section dedicated to the Feather's Tail Children's Village. In fact, the only reason I know he has a church on the property in the first place is because I sifted through hours and hours of his content until I found this.
Many people call it, oh, there's a preacher in the background. There's a preacher using a megaphone in the village, so if you hear something, that's what it is.
That's from the same clip where he talks about those godly feather messages, by the way. Now, the fact that he's running this church out of the charity should be a little concerning. First off, the charity is funded entirely through donations. In the government financial documents for his charity, he lists most of the avenues for financial donations. Since Patreon is advertised as another medium for Share Tanzania, I could only assume that it's included in their final calculations. With all that being said, seeing as how this is a non-profit charity, he's actually required to list all the expenditures, what services everything goes to, and what activities are actually taking place at the children's village. He seems to purposely leave the church out, more than likely because in order to keep the church running, he has to dip into those donations. And well, the church doesn't directly in any way provide for the welfare of those children. It's an entirely selfish venture on John St. Julian's part, and worst of all, it takes away from the resources he could be using to provide for those kids. Oh, and I know it's his church because he says so when he visits the forest where God told him to start it.
I probably learned more about God in these forests than anywhere else on the world apart from my time and service in Tanzania. My church, and without a doubt, the start of my spiritual awakening, very much has its foundations here.
So the guy most definitely is doing something unethical in Tanzania. But if you combine the fact that the guy seems to have some sort of divine connection with God, the fact that he secretly runs a church out of the village that more than likely centers around his specific set of beliefs, the fact that most members of his church are going to be the members of the children's village, who we all know are in very vulnerable states, mind you, and are likely to seek comfort in the church, I'd say there's a strong possibility that John St. Julian here is actually running a cult in Tanzania that just so happens to take advantage of these impoverished peoples. And just to kick you while you're down, it's also on the back of all the people who are donating to his charity. Now, John St. Julian seems to borrow a lot of his ideology from Gnostic Christianity. Much like the Mormons, Gnostic Christians use their own text in conjunction with the Bible, only theirs is called the Nag Hammadi Library. It's a collection of 52 books, complete with its own Gospels. The most notable probably being the Gospel of Thomas. Its own creation story, which I'm going to let John here briefly explain to you guys.
The Archon created this reality and forgot that it was not the original God. But what it also says is that the Archon took its mother, the Sophia, and trapped it in matter to use that energy. So it says the fragmentation of that energy is us. We are the Sophia trapped in matter.
Oh, and apparently its own plagiarized version of Plato's Republic, edited of course to include Gnostic teachings. It just seems you can't have any form of Christianity without at least a little bit of plagiarism. Now, I'll be honest with you, if it's not completely obvious already, I haven't totally figured out Gnosticism yet. Every single source that I found on the subject, including John St. Julian here, seems to have completely different opinions on what seem to be the very core beliefs of Gnosticism. And to some extent, I guess that might even be explainable. Within Gnosticism is this idea of gnosis. Now, it's the Greek word for knowledge, but Gnostic Christians use it to mean a little bit something different. And depending on where you look, it also means different things. Generally, it can be boiled down to enlightenment, a sort of truth about reality and God that you have to experience yourself. Oh yeah, and that apparent necessity to explain gnosis in a way that generally conforms to the culture at the time. I'd call that a cop-out, especially since they literally fucking plagiarized Plato's Republic. But what that kind of idea creates, however, is hundreds of websites and hundreds of followers that all explain Gnostic concepts in different ways using entirely different words. Like the sacred secretion, for instance. Jim Carrey and John St. Julian are actually explaining the exact same thing, only with different words.
I believe the knowledge of the sacred secretion, which he's just spoken about, and he calls it the alchemy of transformation of sexual energy, which is another way of perceiving it. If you're sexually moral and you don't overindulge and become overly acidic, etc., then absolutely you can call it that.
But as you could probably tell from that last clip, John St. Julian is only okay with interpretations from people he deems to be sexually moral. Whatever the fuck that means. Gnosis, being like a state of enlightenment, is written as a sort of achievable state, something that you can obtain. John St. Julian just believes that the way to achieve that enlightenment is through the sacred secretion. He just also seems to attach a lot of magical thinking to that state.
And that's how it should be for all humans. That's how it was for the native tribes. But thus, we've gotten lost, and we think that our two hands and our 2 feet are the things that can do it for us. They can to some degree, but without the sacred secretion, you're 30% of the human being you can be.
And that's why I think what John St. Julian is doing is kind of dangerous. Feather's Tail Village houses nearly 100 kids, a lot of which are special needs or suffer from terrible diseases. A lot of these kids were abused and came from broken homes. And instead of maybe providing proper counseling for these kids, instead of providing better emergency care, he instead runs a church out of the village that offers no real solutions. Just a magical brain juice cure-all.
If our children were taught how to preserve that substance to get their body to vibrate in a way where they are constantly a tuned antenna of prayer to the realm of God, and thus their heart is always roaring, always happy. That is the sacred secretion. That is the importance of it. And a man I made a video about recently, Jim Carrey, has just spoken about it in the public eye.
Now I plan on covering John a lot more on my channel. The rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than just the sacred secretion nonsense, and honestly, I haven't even gotten into debunking the pseudoscience of it all. John's definitely going to be a recurring figure on my channel. Now I think I'm going to end the video right here, but if that's something you're interested in, or if you want to see more of my work, consider going over to my channel and throw me a sub. Before I go though, I just want to say thank you to Philosophically Godless for giving me the opportunity to guest on his channel. Being a fan, it's really cool to be a part of Philosophically Godless history, and honestly, it's really cool that I was able to help out. To those of you that are still here, thank you for tuning in. You've been watching Philosophically Godless. I'm the Atheist Rationale. Don't panic.